The Woman with the Cure. The True Crime Story of Linda Burfield Hazzard. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Acknowledgements. This book was written in the shadow of a simple fact. People went to starvation heights seeking help. That fact shaped every choice on the page. It required restraint. It required refusal of spectacle. It required a commitment to treat victims not as narrative devices, but as people whose suffering should not be repurposed for entertainment. If this manuscript succeeds anywhere, it is because it kept returning to that ethical center. I want to acknowledge first, the individuals whose names survive in the record only because harm forced them into view. In cases like this, the archive is uneven. It preserves what courts and newspapers considered legible. It forgets what private systems were able to absorb. The people who suffered under coercive care deserve more than the brief appearances history allows them. This book cannot restore what was taken, but it can refuse to treat their pain lightly. I also acknowledge the survivors and families who carried the burden of making harm visible. When institutions hesitate, it is often survivors who supply the pressure that forces action. Their testimony is rarely rewarded with peace. It is nevertheless the hinge upon which accountability turns. The ability to speak after harm is never guaranteed. When it occurs, it changes what can be known. A project like this depends on the work of historians, archivists, librarians, and local researchers who keep difficult records accessible. Legal history, medical history, and the history of reform movements can be stubbornly fragmented across jurisdictions and genres. The scholars who map those landscapes make it possible to write responsibly without collapsing complexity into cliché. I am also indebted to those who have documented the cultural history of health reform and alternative medicine. Starvation Heights is not understandable as an isolated scandal. It sits within broader movements that moralist discipline, elevated deprivation as virtue, and promised bodily transformation through willpower. Reading those histories makes clear that the danger did not begin with one retreat. It began with a world that made such retreats plausible. This manuscript is part of a continuing body of work on private authority, the ways power hides in domestic spaces, care industries, and the quietly sanctioned domains where oversight is optional. Writing across these cases has reinforced the same unsettling lesson: harm survives longest where it is framed as normal, useful, or deserved. I am grateful to readers who have followed that thread and insisted, by their attention, that serious historical true crime can be something other than spectacle. Finally, my thanks belong to the patient practice of writing itself. This is not a story that benefits from haste. It asked for deliberate pacing, repeated revisiting, and a constant check against dramatization. If there is a voice in these pages, it is a voice built from that discipline. Any errors of interpretation remain my responsibility. Preface. People did not arrive at Linda Burfield Hazzard's retreat because they wished to die. They arrived because they hoped to be cured. At the turn of the 20th century, faith in medicine was uneven and often fragile. Scientific advances sat alongside uncertainty, and many people moved between orthodox doctors, home remedies, and alternative healers in search of relief. Chronic illness, fatigue, nervous disorders, and digestive complaints were common, poorly understood, and often dismissed. For women in particular, pain was frequently minimized or reframed as moral weakness. Against this backdrop, the promise of a cure carried enormous weight. Hazzard's promise was simple and absolute. Illness, she claimed, was caused by the accumulation of toxins. The solution was fasting. Food was not nourishment but obstruction, and deprivation was framed as discipline rather than danger. Those who submitted fully, who obeyed the regimen without resistance, would emerge purified and healed. This idea was not marginal. It circulated widely in early 20th century wellness culture, promoted through books, lectures, and sanitariums that blended moral instruction with bodily control. Fasting was framed as scientific, natural, and virtuous. Suffering during treatment was not evidence of harm but proof that the cure was working. Hazzard understood this cultural moment well. She styled herself as a doctor, established a retreat in rural Washington state, and offered an experience that combined authority, isolation, and certainty. Patients were removed from their ordinary lives and placed into a tightly controlled environment where food was restricted, labor was imposed, and obedience was treated as therapeutic commitment. Deterioration was interpreted as progress. Resistance was framed as failure. This book does not ask whether Hazzard believed in her cure. That question, while tempting, is ultimately less important than how belief operated within the system she built. The harm that occurred at Starvation Heights did not require conscious malice to proceed. It required only authority without oversight, patience without power, and a framework that redefined suffering as treatment. As with the other books in this series, the focus here is not spectacle. The deaths associated with Hazzard's practice were real, but they are not presented as moral theater. Instead, this book examines how harm became normalized within a setting explicitly dedicated to care. It traces how patients were persuaded to stay, how deterioration was rationalized, how financial control followed physical weakness, and how intervention was delayed even as the consequences became visible to those outside the retreat. Neighbors saw patients in town and described them as emaciated. Rumors circulated. Concern existed. Yet the retreat continued to operate. This is not because warning signs were absent, but because the institution sat in a gray zone between medicine and belief, private enterprise and personal choice. What happened there was framed as voluntary, therapeutic, and internal. That framing insulated it from scrutiny. The case that eventually brought Hazzard to trial did not emerge because regulators systematically examined her practice. It emerged because one patient survived long enough to speak after another died. Even then, the legal response was cautious and limited. Hazzard served time, was released, and later resumed her work. The system corrected an individual instance of harm without dismantling the conditions that allowed it. This pattern should be familiar. Across different historical settings, private authority repeatedly becomes dangerous when it is shielded by trust. Estates, households, workplaces, and institutions all rely on a belief that those in charge will act responsibly. When that belief is combined with isolation and dependency, it creates an environment where abuse can be reframed as discipline, neglect as treatment, and coercion as choice. Hazzard's retreat was not a commune in the utopian sense, but it functioned as a closed world. Patients were separated from outside support, subjected to a rigid routine, and encouraged to distrust dissenting voices. Leaving was framed as weakness. Staying was framed as commitment. The language of healing masked the reality of control. This book places the woman with the cure alongside the woman in service and the lady of the estate not because these women are alike in temperament, but because the structures they inhabited are. Each exercised authority within a domain that claimed moral legitimacy. Each relied on systems that prioritized order, trust, and deference over accountability. Each was confronted only when harm became impossible to ignore. The aim here is not to retroactively diagnose Hazzard, nor to reduce her to caricature. It is to examine how wellness culture, gendered trust, economic vulnerability, and weak regulation converged to produce a setting where people were starved in the name of health. It is to show how easily care can become coercive when those receiving it are taught to doubt their own perceptions. The story of Starvation Heights is not an anomaly sealed in the past. Its logic persists wherever suffering is rebranded as improvement and obedience as cure. Understanding how that logic operated in Hazzard's time is a way of recognizing its continued presence in our own. This book proceeds slowly and deliberately. It favors structure over shock, context over conjecture, and restraint over moral display. Where the record is clear, it is used. Where it is incomplete, that absence is acknowledged. The goal is not to provide a satisfying ending, but to offer an explanation that remains faithful to what can be known. Linda Burfield Hazzard promised healing. What she created instead was a system where trust became a liability and care became a mechanism of harm. Understanding how that happened is the purpose of what follows. Chapter 1. Becoming Dr. Hazzard. Linda Laura Burfield was born on December 18, 1867 in Carver, Minnesota, the eldest of 7 children. She grew up in a United States where sickness was common, medical care was uneven, and health was already a marketplace. Patent medicines, home cures, mail-order remedies, and itinerant healers flourished alongside university-trained doctors. In that crowded world, a persuasive voice could sound like expertise, and a confident promise could look like knowledge. For women, the search for care was often sharpened by dismissal. Complaints that did not fit tidy categories were regularly treated as nerves, weakness, hysteria, or moral failing. The line between treatment and judgment could be thin, and many people learned to look elsewhere for relief, particularly when orthodox medicine offered little certainty, limited compassion, or expensive failure. Hazzard's later success depended on this climate of need. Before she became Dr. Hazzard, she first became someone willing to refashion herself. Her name appears in sources as Linda or Linda Laura Burfield, and later as Linda Burfield Hazzard. Her story is not one of conventional medical training. It is instead a story of self-authorized authority, the kind of authority that grows where regulation is thin and belief is culturally primed. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the language of health was changing. Modern living, urban life, processed foods, sedentary habits, was frequently blamed for degeneration. A popular moral logic developed around the body: restraint was virtue, appetite was failure, and discipline was salvation. Diet reform movements, hygienic living campaigns, and sanitarium culture spread through newspapers, lectures, and books. Fasting sat comfortably inside this moral logic. For some advocates, fasting was framed as a return to nature. For others, it was framed as science. One influential promoter was Edward Hooker Dewey, a physician who argued that reduced eating and fasting could restore health, and Hazzard later claimed she studied under him. This is where her cure begins to come into focus, not as an isolated delusion, but as an idea with a ready audience. Hazzard promoted prolonged fasting as a near-universal remedy, a way to purge toxins and restore the body's balance. She put these claims into print in 1908 with Fasting for the Cure of Disease. Publishing mattered. A book did more than advertise. It conferred legitimacy. It let a practitioner sound systematic, principled, and proven. It also traveled ahead of her, reaching people who would never meet her but might trust her. Trust is the true currency of the wellness marketplace. Hazzard's authority was also aided by law. In Washington state, she was able to practice through a loophole that licensed some alternative practitioners without a conventional medical degree. That detail is crucial, not as trivia, but because it shows how easily legitimacy can be produced when the state offers a credential that looks official, even if the pathway to it is weak. A license changes the social texture of belief. It allows patients to tell themselves, and one another, that this is not merely a treatment but medicine. By the early 1900s, Hazzard established her practice in Washington and later ran a sanitarium in Olalla, Kitsap County, an isolated setting that became notorious under the local nickname Starvation Heights. The location mattered. Rural distance offered privacy. Privacy offered control. Control allowed a regimen to become a world. This is the point where the book's central argument begins to tighten. A fasting cure does not operate only through ideology. It operates through environment. In a patient's own home, family and friends can interrupt, question, feed, remove. In a retreat, the practitioner controls routine, food, information, and movement. The retreat becomes a closed system where suffering can be reinterpreted as progress and where resistance can be framed as moral weakness. Hazzard's retreat was built for that kind of reinterpretation. She did not simply offer a diet. She offered a total program: deprivation presented as healing, obedience presented as commitment, and decline presented as purification. Later accounts describe locals encountering skeletal patients and escapees seeking food, details that speak to how visible the outcomes could become even beyond the property's boundaries. Yet visibility alone does not produce intervention. That is the pattern this book keeps returning to. Hazzard's earliest years do not explain what happened at Starvation Heights as a psychological inevitability. They explain its plausibility. She emerged in a time when health culture welcomed certainty, when moral discipline could be sold as science, and when regulation allowed a determined practitioner to style herself as a doctor with little to stop her. Chapter 2: Starvation Heights, Building a Closed World. By the time people arrived in Olalla, they were rarely looking for an argument. They were looking for relief. They came tired, frightened, unwell, and often disappointed by ordinary medicine. Some arrived with chronic complaints that refused to resolve. Others arrived with conditions that frightened them into trying anything that promised certainty. What Linda Burfield Hazzard offered was certainty. Not the careful, conditional certainty of a cautious clinician, but the absolute certainty of a true believer and a persuasive operator. A retreat makes certainty easier to sell. A person who visits a practitioner in town can leave after an appointment and return to ordinary life. Family can intervene. Friends can question. Familiar meals can interrupt a regimen that feels wrong. In the home, doubt has room to breathe. In a retreat, doubt is contained. Olala was rural, wooded, and quiet. The property sat away from scrutiny in the way many health resorts did, trading on the restorative promise of fresh air and distance from city life. The language of retreat was not only marketing. It was a structure. It removed patients from the ordinary networks that might have corrected or challenged what was happening. Once a patient entered starvation heights, daily life narrowed. The world became Hazzard's routine, Hazzard's rules, Hazzard's interpretation of the body. Food restriction was not merely a component of the cure, it was the core instrument through which authority was exercised. When a person is hungry, they become weaker. When they are weak, they become more dependent. When they are dependent, they become easier to manage. This is the first principle of closed systems: control the essentials. Hazzard's treatment relied on deprivation presented as virtue. Fasting was framed as cleansing, and suffering was reframed as proof. Hunger pains were not warnings but signs of toxins leaving the body. Dizziness and faintness were not danger but progress. A patient's fear became a symptom to be treated, not a signal to be trusted. Once suffering is redefined as healing, harm becomes difficult to name. A retreat also changes the meaning of consent. A patient may arrive voluntarily, but voluntariness becomes fragile once the person is isolated, weakened, and told that leaving will make them worse. In that context, the choice to stay can begin to look like a choice, but feel like inevitability. The retreat's power did not rest on locks alone. It rested on persuasion and dependency. Patients were expected to submit not only physically but morally. They were taught to see appetite as corruption and obedience as commitment. If they questioned the regimen, that questioning could be interpreted as weakness, lack of discipline, or failure to understand the cure. Doubt was not treated as reasonable. It was treated as pathology. This is how ideology becomes an instrument of control. The routines at starvation heights reportedly included restricted intake, enforced rest punctuated by prescribed activity, and labor that blurred the line between therapy and exploitation. In wellness culture, labor can be framed as wholesome: walking, gardening, cleaning, keeping busy. In a setting where people are being starved, that same labor becomes a mechanism of exhaustion. Work increases compliance. It also reduces resistance. A person who is tired, hungry, and constantly managed has little energy left for rebellion. The retreat's domestic order was central to its authority. In institutional spaces, domestic routines feel reassuring. Meals, schedules, quiet hours, and rules create the impression of care. Yet domestic order can also hide coercion. It can make control look like responsibility. This was the paradox of starvation heights. It was marketed as a place of healing. It functioned as a place where power was concentrated and where the boundary between treatment and domination could disappear. Patients were placed in a position where they could no longer easily judge their own condition. Their bodies were interpreted for them. Their fear was reclassified as symptom. Their decline was described as improvement. The retreat thus became a world where the only reliable narrative was the one offered by the person in charge. Outside the property, the town could see fragments of what was happening. Locals sometimes saw patients in town and described them as unusually thin, exhausted, and unwell. The fact that these sightings entered local talk is important because it shows that the retreat was not fully invisible. It was not hidden behind perfect secrecy. It existed within a community that noticed. Noticing, however, is not the same as intervening. People might have been uneasy, but unease has no legal force. Alternative health practices were common. Patients were adults. A retreat could claim privacy. The line between eccentric treatment and criminal harm was not always obvious to outsiders, especially when patients themselves might insist the cure was working, repeating the language they had been taught. This is another principle of closed systems. The victims can be made to defend the system that harms them. Starvation changes the mind as well as the body. It narrows thought. It distorts judgment. It increases suggestibility. It produces a kind of tunnel vision. Focus on the next hour, the next instruction, the next chance to please the authority who controls access to food. In that state, a patient can lose the ability to accurately assess risk. The retreat's narrative fills the gap. Even when a patient sensed danger, leaving was not simple. They might have arrived with limited money, limited transport, and no nearby support. They might have been told that outside food would kill them. They might have been told that ordinary doctors were ignorant or corrupt. They might have been ashamed to admit they were frightened, particularly if they had invested hope and money into the cure. Shame is a powerful fence. It keeps people where they are even without physical restraint. This is also where the economics of the retreat begins to matter. A health retreat is not simply an idea. It is a business. Patients pay. They sign agreements. They sometimes hand over money for extended stays. The longer they remain, the more the retreat earns. If the retreat also gains access to a patient's financial affairs, the stakes shift again. Control of the body becomes linked to control of property. The retreat becomes not only a clinic but an extraction site. Hazzard did not need to present herself as a criminal to benefit from this structure. She needed only to occupy the role of healer in a culture eager to believe. That role came with built-in defenses. A healer can claim that deterioration is part of the process. A healer can accuse critics of misunderstanding. A healer can cast doubt as the enemy of recovery. This is why the retreat could continue even as patients visibly declined. A system that can explain harm as progress can operate for a long time. It does not collapse until something breaks its narrative. That break often arrives through a death that cannot be explained away, a survivor who speaks, or an outsider who has both authority and willingness to intervene. In Hazzard's story, the break came most sharply through the Williamson sisters. Chapter 3: Hunger, Dependence, and Obedience. A fasting cure is not only a set of beliefs about the body. It is a practical method for producing dependence. Most people understand hunger as discomfort. In controlled environments, hunger becomes something else, a lever. It weakens the body, narrows attention, alters judgment, and changes the balance of power between the person who is hungry and the person who decides whether they eat. At starvation heights, food restriction was not incidental to the treatment. It was the treatment, and it was also the mechanism through which Hazzard's authority could become total. When a patient first arrived, they still carried their ordinary sense of the world. They had habits, preferences, doubts, and an instinctive awareness of what their body needed. They might have believed in the cure, but belief does not erase biology. Hunger introduces conflict quickly. It pulls the body in one direction and the doctrine in another. A closed system resolves that conflict by reinterpreting the body. Hazzard's approach required patients to distrust their own signals. Hunger was framed as toxin. Weakness was framed as cleansing. Fear was framed as resistance. The body's alarms were not treated as meaningful, they were treated as symptoms to be overcome. Once a person is taught to doubt their own perception, they must borrow reality from someone else. This is where dependence begins. It is not only physical dependence on food. It is cognitive dependence on interpretation. A hungry person asks, quietly or aloud, "Is this normal? Am I meant to feel this? Is this danger or progress?" In an ordinary setting, those questions might be answered by a partner, family member, or doctor who sees the patient as a person. In a retreat, the answers come from the authority who controls both the narrative and the essentials. If the authority says, "This is healing," then fear becomes something to suppress. If the authority says, "You are weak because you are toxic," then weakness becomes guilt. If the authority says, "Leaving will make you worse," then the thought of escape becomes a threat in itself. In this way, hunger creates not only dependence but obedience. Obedience is often imagined as a simple act of compliance, but in closed environments it is more like a survival strategy. Patients learn quickly what is rewarded and what is punished. Reward might be praise, reassurance, or even a small concession. Punishment might be humiliation, scolding, withdrawal of comfort, or the subtle escalation of restrictions. Even when a patient is not physically restrained, the structure can still feel inescapable. There is another dynamic at work here: exhaustion. Starvation is exhausting. So is constant supervision. So is uncertainty. People in a weakened state have less energy to argue, organize, or insist. They become quieter. They accept explanations they might have challenged when well. They begin to interpret their own distress through the language they are given, because it is easier than holding two realities at once. This is how ideology settles into the body. A retreat can also use routine to deepen obedience. Routine is often marketed as care: a schedule, quiet hours, prescribed rest, set activities. Routine feels safe because it is predictable. Yet predictable routines can be used to eliminate independent choice. When every part of the day is structured, there are fewer opportunities for private conversation, fewer moments to plan departure, fewer chances to seek help. Routine can also break solidarity. Patients may share the same suffering, but if they are kept busy, separated, or discouraged from talking, they cannot easily compare notes. They cannot form a shared language for what is happening. Without shared language, doubt remains personal. Personal doubt is easier to manage than collective doubt. In many coercive settings, that is the aim, keep people alone inside their own minds. Labor fits neatly into this structure. In wellness culture, prescribed activity can be framed as wholesome and restorative. At starvation heights, work could be presented as part of treatment, a way to keep the mind orderly and the body engaged. But when a person is underfed, labor becomes strain. Strain increases weakness. Weakness increases dependence. Dependence increases obedience. It is a simple cycle, and it can be repeated daily without obvious force. A person who is hungry may begin to bargain with the system. They may try to be good in the hope of relief. They may comply more readily because compliance feels like the only available path to comfort. Over time, the system produces the kind of patient it prefers, subdued, grateful for small kindnesses, fearful of disapproval. This is not gullibility. It is what prolonged deprivation does. In the background of all of this sits the question of money. A health retreat is not just an idea about wellness, it is an economic arrangement. Patients arrive with funds, assets, and sometimes a level of vulnerability that makes them eager to hand decisions to someone who seems confident. As the body weakens, practical autonomy weakens as well. A patient may struggle to keep track of their own affairs. They may be persuaded that paperwork is too strenuous, too stressful, or an unhelpful distraction from healing. Financial dependence can follow physical dependence. In many predatory care settings, the shift happens quietly. A helper offers to manage things, to protect the patient from worry, to handle correspondence. The patient may agree because it feels like support. Once the patient agrees, control expands. A person who controls information and access can shape what the patient believes about the outside world, including who is trustworthy and who is not. If family members express concern, they can be framed as harmful influences. If friends urge departure, they can be described as sabotaging recovery. The patient is encouraged to interpret outside contact through the retreat's lens. This is how isolation becomes self-sustaining. Locals noticing emaciated patients is significant for another reason. It shows that the retreat did not only control what happened on the property. It also relied on the community's reluctance to interfere. People may have been unsettled, but what authority did they have to intervene in a private health business? What proof could they offer? The patients were adults. The retreat could claim consent. The line between extreme treatment and criminal harm remained blurred until something forced it into focus. The system, in other words, depended on ambiguity. Ambiguity protects the practitioner. It also traps the patient. If you cannot clearly name what is happening, you cannot clearly oppose it. You may suspect you are being harmed, but you may also fear you are simply failing the cure. The retreat story makes it possible to blame yourself for your own deterioration. That self-blame is one of the strongest forms of control. A patient who blames herself is less likely to accuse the practitioner. This is why the eventual collapse of starvation heights could not come solely from rumor or gradual decline. It needed a rupture. It needed an event that could not be reinterpreted as progress. That rupture arrived when the right kind of patient entered the system, someone with resources, visibility, and an outside world that would not accept disappearance quietly. Someone whose death would not vanish into the ordinary silence surrounding the vulnerable. The Williamson sisters were that rupture. Chapter 4: The Market for Certainty. By the early 20th century, illness was not only a medical problem. It was a social one. People lived longer, moved more, and worked under conditions that strained bodies in unfamiliar ways. Industrial labor, urban crowding, and changing diets produced new patterns of fatigue, digestive complaints, nervous disorders, and chronic pain. Medicine, while advancing, did not yet offer reliable answers for many of these conditions. Treatments could be harsh, invasive, or dismissive. Doctors often admitted uncertainty, and that uncertainty frightened people who were already afraid. Into that gap stepped certainty. Certainty is a powerful commodity when fear is widespread. It does not need to be correct. It needs only to be confident, coherent, and morally persuasive. Linda Hazzard's fasting cure offered exactly that. It promised not a partial improvement or careful management, but resolution. Illness was reframed as a single problem with a single cause and a single solution. Toxins accumulated, fasting removed them. The logic was simple, total, and appealing. This simplicity mattered. Complex explanations require trust in expertise. Simple explanations invite personal commitment. A patient who accepts a simple explanation can feel empowered, even when the explanation leads to harm. The fasting cure turned suffering into purpose. Hunger was no longer a sign of danger, it was proof of discipline. Weakness became evidence of purification. Pain became progress. Wellness culture at the time encouraged this framing. Health reform movements blended physical advice with moral instruction. They promoted restraint, moderation, and self-control as pathways to both bodily and spiritual improvement. Overeating, indulgence, and appetite were often treated as signs of moral failure. In this environment, fasting could be framed not only as healthy, but as virtuous. Hazzard's cure sat comfortably inside these beliefs. She did not need to convince people that starvation was safe. She needed only to convince them that hunger was meaningful. Once hunger was given meaning, endurance became a test of character. Those who failed the test could be blamed for their own decline. This is how markets for certainty operate. They offer explanations that flatter the believer's sense of agency while transferring responsibility away from the system. The wellness market also relied on distrust. Orthodox medicine was frequently portrayed as invasive, greedy, or ignorant. Doctors were accused of treating symptoms rather than causes. Hospitals were depicted as places of suffering rather than healing. Against this backdrop, alternative practitioners could position themselves as compassionate outsiders offering natural solutions the establishment ignored. Hazzard made use of this contrast. She presented herself as someone who understood the body better than conventional doctors. Her authority rested not on institutional affiliation, but on conviction. Patients were encouraged to see themselves as enlightened for choosing her path. Doubt could be reframed as the product of social conditioning rather than rational concern. This created an in-group. Once inside that in-group, patients were less likely to trust warnings from outside. Family members who questioned the cure could be dismissed as fearful or misinformed. Doctors who criticized fasting could be dismissed as invested in outdated practices. The retreat's worldview became self-protecting. Markets for certainty also favor isolation. A retreat removes competing narratives. It limits access to alternative interpretations. It allows a single explanation to dominate. This is why health resorts and sanitariums flourished in rural settings. Distance from cities was marketed as restorative, but it also reduced scrutiny. The combination of certainty and isolation is potent. Patients at starvation heights were not simply paying for treatment. They were paying for meaning. They were paying to believe that their suffering had a purpose and that obedience would be rewarded. This belief could sustain them longer than physical strength alone. It could also sustain the retreat. As long as patients believed, the system could continue. Decline could be explained. Death could be framed as unfortunate but not incriminating. The cure itself was protected by its moral logic. This is why markets for certainty are so difficult to regulate. They do not operate purely as businesses. They operate as belief systems. Regulation can address licensing, advertising, and safety, but belief is harder to confront. When harm occurs, believers may defend the system that harmed them, because admitting harm would require abandoning the meaning that sustained them. The state often hesitates in these situations. Intervening too quickly can look like an attack on personal choice. Intervening too slowly allows harm to escalate. In Hazzard's time, alternative medicine occupied a gray zone where oversight was minimal and responsibility was diffuse. Patients were seen as consenting adults. Practitioners were seen as eccentric rather than dangerous. This hesitation created space for exploitation. The retreat's authority was strengthened by the fact that its patients often arrived already doubting themselves. Chronic illness erodes confidence. Repeated medical failure can make people desperate. Desperation lowers the threshold for trust. Hazzard did not need to create vulnerability. She needed only to receive it. Once vulnerability entered the retreat, it was organized and managed. Hunger intensified dependence. Isolation reduced resistance. Certainty silenced doubt. The market functioned as designed. The collapse of that market required more than suspicion. It required a case that could not be explained away as individual failure or unfortunate coincidence. It required victims whose social standing made their suffering legible to authorities. That is where the Williamson sisters enter the story. Chapter 5. The Williamson Sisters. When Claire and Dora Williamson arrived at Starvation Heights, they did not arrive as social outsiders. They arrived with money, education, and a sense of entitlement to competent care. That distinction matters, not because their lives were more valuable than others, but because their social position altered what would later be possible. The Williamson sisters were British, well-educated, and financially independent. They had traveled widely and were accustomed to making decisions about their own health. Like many people of their class, they were familiar with alternative health ideas and skeptical of orthodox medicine's limitations. When they sought treatment from Linda Hazzard, they did so deliberately, not impulsively. They believed they were choosing a modern, disciplined approach to healing. This belief placed them squarely inside the wellness culture of the period. Chronic illness, particularly digestive and nervous complaints, often resisted medical explanation. For women, such complaints were frequently dismissed or minimized. Seeking an alternative cure was not a sign of irrationality. It was a rational response to repeated disappointment. Hazzard's fasting regime promised not only relief, but control. It offered a system that claimed to make sense of symptoms others had failed to resolve. Once at Starvation Heights, however, the sisters encountered the same narrowing world as every other patient. Food was restricted almost immediately. Hunger was explained as necessary. Weakness was interpreted as cleansing. The sisters' initial discomfort was not treated as a warning, but as confirmation that the cure was working. Like other patients, they were encouraged to submit fully and to trust the process. Submission, in this context, was not passive. It required effort. Patients had to suppress fear, reinterpret pain, and accept explanations that contradicted instinct. The sisters, like others, were drawn into a logic that made resistance feel dangerous. To question the cure was to risk failure. To leave was to abandon the chance of recovery. The cost of doubt grew as the body weakened. Over time, the sisters' conditions deteriorated. Weight loss became extreme. Fatigue deepened. Mobility declined. What might have prompted immediate medical intervention in another setting was reframed at the retreat as progress. This reframing did not require deception alone. It relied on repetition, authority, and the erosion of physical and cognitive strength. The sisters were also isolated from ordinary support. Correspondence was controlled. Outside voices were filtered. Concerns raised by friends or family could be dismissed as ignorance. Within the retreat, Hazzard's interpretation dominated. As the sisters weakened, their capacity to challenge that interpretation diminished. This is where the story shifts from belief to captivity. Leaving Starvation Heights was theoretically possible. In practice, it became increasingly difficult. The sisters were unwell, disoriented, and dependent. They had been taught to fear ordinary food. They had been told that interruption could be fatal. Even the act of imagining departure required energy they no longer had. At some point, the sisters were no longer patients choosing a treatment. They were bodies being managed. Claire Williamson died under Hazzard's care. Her death was not immediately treated as evidence of wrongdoing. Within the retreat's logic, it could be explained as the tragic failure of a body too damaged to heal. This explanation was familiar. It had been used before. What made Claire's death different was not the fact of death itself, but who she was. Dora Williamson survived. Her survival mattered because it allowed continuity. A dead person cannot testify. A survivor can. Dora was weak, traumatized, and grieving, but she was alive. She could speak. She could describe what had happened. She could compare the promises made with the reality endured. Survivors disrupt closed systems in a way that deaths alone often do not. Dora's account transformed rumor into allegation. It gave authorities something to work with. It made the retreat's practices legible as harm rather than eccentricity. Her social standing also mattered. She was not easily dismissed as unreliable or marginal. Her voice carried weight. This is a recurring pattern in cases of private authority. Abuse becomes actionable not when it is most severe, but when it becomes visible through someone whose suffering is recognizable to those in power. Many patients at starvation heights had suffered. Many had deteriorated. Some had died. But it was the death of a woman like Claire Williamson, and the testimony of a survivor like Dora, that broke the system's insulation. This does not diminish the suffering of others. It exposes the inequality of attention. The Williamson sisters did not cause the harm at starvation heights. They revealed it. Their presence made it impossible to continue pretending that what was happening was simply unconventional care. Their case forced the question that had been deferred for too long: was this treatment, or was it abuse? Once that question could no longer be avoided, the retreat's logic began to unravel. Chapter 6: When the law arrives late. The law did not arrive at starvation heights because it was vigilant. It arrived because silence finally failed. For years, Hazzard's retreat operated in a space where concern could exist without consequence. Locals noticed. Patients declined. Rumors circulated. None of this triggered formal intervention because none of it clearly crossed the threshold the law required. The retreat presented itself as private, voluntary, and therapeutic. Patients were adults. The cure was unconventional, but unconventional was not illegal. This is how harm persists in plain sight. The death of Claire Williamson changed the calculus not because death was unprecedented, but because the circumstances could no longer be absorbed into the language of unfortunate outcome. A wealthy foreign woman had died under an extreme regimen. Her sister survived and was prepared to speak. The case became legible as something more than eccentric medicine. Legibility matters more to law than suffering. Once Dora Williamson's account entered official channels, Starvation Heights could be named as a site of potential wrongdoing. Naming transforms space. A retreat becomes a crime scene. A healer becomes a suspect. A cure becomes a practice subject to scrutiny. Even then, the response was cautious. Authorities did not move with urgency or outrage. They moved methodically and narrowly. The question they faced was not whether fasting was harmful in principle, but whether Hazzard's actions could be proven to have caused death. This distinction is crucial. Law does not operate on moral discomfort. It operates on causation, evidence, and thresholds. The investigation focused on what could be demonstrated. How much food was given? What condition patients were in? What advice was offered? What authority Hazzard exercised over movement and care? Each of these questions required translation. Suffering had to be converted into facts. Fear had to be stripped of emotion. Decline had to be measured rather than felt. This process is never neutral. It favors what can be counted and documented over what can only be described. Starvation complicates causation. Bodies weaken gradually. Death may come through secondary effects: infection, organ failure, exhaustion. A defense can argue that illness pre-existed treatment. It can argue that the patient consented. It can argue that fasting did not kill, but merely failed to save. These arguments do not need to be true in a moral sense to be effective legally. Hazzard's defense relied on the language of choice. Patients came voluntarily. They stayed willingly. They believed in the cure. Consent, however, is not static. It changes under pressure. Law struggles to account for that change, especially in environments where coercion is psychological rather than overt. The retreat did not need bars on the windows to restrict freedom. It needed belief, fear, and dependence. These are difficult to prosecute. The prosecution's challenge was to show that Hazzard's authority crossed a line from treatment into control. That she did not merely offer an extreme regimen, but enforced it in ways that deprived patients of autonomy and safety. That she benefited financially from prolonged suffering. That her certainty overrode the evidence of harm. Even then, the scope of the case remained limited. The law did not examine Starvation Heights as a system. It examined a death. The broader pattern of deterioration among patients remained largely outside the frame. Other deaths did not automatically become charges. Other survivors did not all testify. The focus narrowed to what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. This narrowing is not failure. It is how the law functions. Yet it has consequences. It allows systems of harm to be dismantled partially while leaving their logic intact. It allows an institution to be paused, penalized, and then potentially resumed. It allows the story to be told as an individual failing rather than a structural one. Hazzard was convicted and sentenced. The conviction was significant. It marked a rare moment when alternative medical practice was publicly challenged. It acknowledged that the retreat's authority had been abused. It recognized that deprivation could be lethal even when framed as care. But the punishment was not final. Hazzard served time and was released. She later returned to fasting practices elsewhere. The system corrected an episode without dismantling the ideology that sustained it. The market for certainty did not disappear. It shifted. This outcome reveals the law's limits. Law can intervene when harm becomes undeniable. It can punish individuals. It can signal boundaries. What it cannot easily do is regulate belief or dismantle private authority built on trust rather than force. It cannot easily prevent people from consenting to their own harm when that harm is framed as healing. The case against Hazzard did not close the chapter on starvation cures. It closed a chapter on one retreat. This is why the arrival of law should not be mistaken for resolution. For Dora Williamson, the trial offered a form of recognition. Her account was heard. Her sister's death was acknowledged as wrongful. That mattered. It did not restore what was lost. It did not undo the damage to her body or trust. But it pierced the retreat's narrative in a way that could not be fully repaired. For the wider public, the case offered reassurance. A line had been drawn. A wrong had been punished. The system could be trusted again. That reassurance was incomplete. Chapter 7, Punishment Without Prevention. A conviction feels like an ending. In cases like this, it is often only an interruption. When Linda Burfield Hazzard was sentenced, the public story could be told in a familiar shape: wrongdoing exposed, offender punished, danger contained. That story is emotionally satisfying because it suggests that systems correct themselves once harm becomes visible. Starvation Heights does not support that comfort. What followed Hazzard's conviction demonstrates a stubborn truth about private authority: it can survive exposure. It can adapt. It can relocate. It can continue under new names, new settings, and the same moral logic. The punishment did not dismantle the belief in fasting as cure. It did not erase the cultural appetite for certainty. It did not create lasting safeguards for the next desperate patient who would be drawn to a promise of health. It punished an individual case. It did not prevent recurrence. This is partly because the law's tools are limited. Criminal courts are built to respond to discrete offenses, not to regulate whole ideologies. They punish what can be proven. They do not, as a rule, legislate the future. But it is also because the structures that made Starvation Heights possible remained intact. Health retreats still existed. Alternative medicine still flourished. People still distrusted mainstream doctors. Women still struggled to have pain taken seriously. And regulation still lagged behind the market. In such an environment, punishment becomes theater more than protection. It signals that extremes will be addressed when they become scandalous, but it does not stop lesser harms from continuing quietly. Even the framing of Hazzard's case contributed to this. It was easy for many observers to treat her as an aberration, a woman who took an idea too far, a practitioner who crossed a line, a singular scandal. That framing preserved the wider wellness culture by implying that the problem lay in one person's misconduct, rather than in a marketplace that rewarded certainty and tolerated suffering when it was presented as discipline. The bad practitioner story is always more comfortable than the dangerous structure story. A particularly unsettling feature of Hazzard's post-conviction story is that she did not vanish into obscurity in the way a cautionary tale might suggest. The public record indicates that her life continued beyond sentencing, and that fasting ideology did not lose its power over audiences. The appetite for cures did not collapse because one cure had killed. If anything, the case demonstrated how resilient such markets are. When people are unwell, they do not stop seeking hope because of someone else's tragedy. They often seek hope more urgently. They may tell themselves they are different, more careful, more discerning. They may believe they can take the good part of the cure and avoid the danger. They may trust that they will know when to leave. Starvation undermines that confidence. This is why prevention is more difficult than punishment. Prevention requires systems to acknowledge vulnerability before catastrophe. It requires regulation to anticipate harm rather than react to scandal. It requires institutions to accept that consent can be compromised by dependence. In Hazzard's context, those acknowledgements were politically and culturally hard to sustain. There was also a gendered component to how punishment was received. A woman who styled herself as a doctor was already a complicated figure in early 20th century public imagination. Female authority in medicine was growing, but still contested. A scandal involving a woman healer could therefore be processed in ways that reassured existing biases. She was a fraud, a pretender, a dangerous woman who stepped outside her proper sphere. That interpretation does not protect patients. It protects stereotypes. If Hazzard was treated as a bad woman, rather than as a symptom of structural vulnerability, the public could feel that order had been restored by putting her back in her place. Yet the underlying problem, private authority in the space of care, remained unexamined. This kind of moral sorting is common. It allows society to condemn without learning. The most important question after conviction is not whether Hazzard deserved punishment. It is whether anyone was made safer. To answer that, we have to look at what changed. Did regulators strengthen oversight of alternative practitioners? Did communities develop clearer pathways for intervention when patients were visibly deteriorating? Did courts establish precedents that made similar cases easier to prosecute? Did public understanding of consent and coercion in care settings deepen? The evidence from many comparable cases suggests that changes, when they occur, are often narrow. They create modest barriers, but not a complete defense. They may make the next scandal harder to sustain, but they rarely eliminate the underlying market. This is the frustrating lesson of many true crime histories. Punishment can coexist with continued vulnerability. In Hazzard's story, this lesson is sharpened by the fact that the retreat's operating logic was so legible in hindsight. Restrict food. Isolate patients. Control the narrative. Extract money. Yet at the time, the logic was protected by the language of health. It hid in plain sight. That is what makes it dangerous. Chapter 8, Bodies, Money, and Control. At starvation heights, the management of bodies and the management of money were never separate processes. They moved together, tightening in tandem as patients weakened. Illness creates vulnerability. Prolonged hunger intensifies it. Once a person's physical strength declines, ordinary tasks become difficult. Concentration falters. Decisions feel overwhelming. In that state, offers of help can feel like relief rather than intrusion. A practitioner who already controls food, routine, and interpretation of the body is well positioned to extend that control into financial life. This is not unique to Hazzard's retreat. It is a familiar pattern in many coercive care settings. Physical dependence creates the conditions under which economic dependence can follow. Patients arriving at starvation heights often brought money with them. Retreats required payment. Extended stays cost more. Some patients arrived with savings, investments, or property, particularly those who had traveled from abroad or who belonged to comfortable social classes. These resources were part of what made the retreat viable as a business. But money did not remain a neutral transaction. As patients weakened, they were less able to manage correspondence, banking, or legal matters. Letters could feel exhausting. Concentration required to read documents might be gone. Decisions that once felt manageable now felt dangerous. In that space, delegation could seem sensible. A trusted authority offering to take care of things could appear compassionate. Once a practitioner steps into that role, boundaries blur quickly. Handling payments can turn into overseeing accounts. Managing practicalities can turn into controlling access. A patient may no longer know exactly what has been signed, transferred, or promised. Weakness makes vigilance difficult. Trust fills the gap. Trust is often framed as virtue. In closed systems, it becomes a liability. There are reports that Hazzard and her husband involved themselves in patients' financial affairs, particularly as those patients became more dependent. The precise details vary across accounts, but the pattern is consistent with other cases of predatory care. Control over the body opens the door to control over property. Control over property increases the incentive to prolong dependence. This incentive does not require explicit planning. It can emerge naturally from the structure. If a patient recovers quickly, the relationship ends. If a patient stays weak, the relationship continues. If the practitioner benefits financially from that continuation, the system rewards harm. In such a system, deterioration can become profitable. This does not mean every action was consciously calculated. Systems do not require constant intention to function. They require only that incentives align in a way that discourages interruption. At starvation heights, interruption could come from several directions: patient departure, outside intervention, or death. Departure threatened income and authority. Intervention threatened legitimacy. Death, while risky, could sometimes be absorbed into the narrative of failed cure or unavoidable illness, particularly when the patient was already described as gravely unwell. The retreat's framing softened the edges of loss. Patients were encouraged to see financial decisions as part of their healing journey. Stress was described as harmful. Thinking about money could be framed as toxic worry. Delegation could be framed as surrendering burdens for the sake of recovery. This language matters. When economic control is framed as care, resistance becomes difficult. A patient who insists on managing their own affairs might be portrayed as anxious or obstructive. One who hands control over can be praised for trust and commitment. Over time, the retreat becomes not just a place of treatment, but a place where identity shifts. Patients are no longer independent adults managing their own lives. They are subjects within a regime that defines what is good for them. This shift is subtle. It happens gradually. It often goes unnoticed until it is too late. The Williamson sisters' case is revealing precisely because it disrupted this pattern. Their social standing and financial independence made their decline harder to ignore. Their deaths could not be quietly absorbed without raising questions. Dora Williamson's survival meant that financial arrangements could be scrutinized alongside bodily harm. Once money enters legal proceedings, the tone changes. Economic exploitation is often easier to articulate than psychological coercion. Documents can be examined. Transfers can be traced. Motives can be inferred. While starvation is slow and complex to prove, financial benefit offers a clearer narrative of wrongdoing. This is why many cases of coercive care are prosecuted not primarily as violence, but as fraud, neglect, or abuse of trust. The law is more comfortable with stolen money than stolen autonomy. At starvation heights, the intertwining of care and commerce created a setting where harm could be normalized and profit protected. Patients paid for their own weakening. Their suffering sustained the retreat's operation. Their trust became the raw material of the business. This does not mean patients were foolish. They were responding to pain, fear, and hope in a culture that offered few reliable answers. They placed trust where trust was invited. That invitation came wrapped in authority, certainty, and moral language. Refusing it would have required strength many no longer had. This is the quiet cruelty of systems like Hazzard's. They do not rely on overt force. They rely on need. They rely on exhaustion. They rely on the idea that surrendering control is sometimes the price of care. The economic dimension of starvation heights also explains why intervention was delayed. Financial arrangements between adults were considered private. Even when concerns arose, they were difficult to frame as criminal without clear evidence of fraud or coercion. The retreat existed in a legal gray zone where choice and exploitation overlapped. Gray zones protect predators. They allow harm to continue until something sharp cuts through ambiguity. In Hazzard's case, that cut came through death, testimony, and money converging in a way that could not be ignored. Yet even then, the response was partial. Chapter 9. What the Court Could Name. When starvation heights entered the courtroom, it did not arrive as a whole system. It arrived as a case. That difference is not technical. It is decisive. A closed world can be sustained for years because its harms are diffuse, cumulative, and difficult to isolate into a single provable act. Courts, by contrast, prefer sharp edges. They want dates, sequences, causes, and responsibilities that can be stated clearly and defended under cross-examination. They work best with events, not environments. So the first thing the legal process did was narrow the story. The courtroom was not built to ask whether a fasting cure was inherently dangerous, or whether a retreat could become coercive through isolation and dependence. It was built to ask whether one death could be attributed to one person's actions in a way that satisfied the threshold of guilt. This shift immediately shaped what could be said. Starvation is a slow harm. It does not always leave a single signature that points neatly to intent. Bodies fail gradually, sometimes through secondary complications. The defense can argue that the patient was already ill. It can argue that fasting was voluntary. It can argue that decline was part of the patient's condition rather than the practitioner's doing. Even when the reality is clear to those who lived it, the courtroom demands a different sort of clarity. This is where the retreat's ideology became a legal shield. If suffering is framed as treatment, then deterioration can be framed as unfortunate but not criminal. If the patient is framed as a consenting adult, then confinement becomes hard to define. If the cure is framed as a sincerely held medical belief, then harm can be reframed as error rather than exploitation. Sincerity is not safety, but it can complicate prosecution. The prosecution's task, then, was not simply to describe what happened. It was to translate a slow, coercive environment into a legal narrative that would hold. That translation depended heavily on the kinds of evidence the court recognized. Visible emaciation mattered, but it was not enough on its own. People can be thin for many reasons. The question was whether the thinness was imposed, whether it was sustained through coercion, and whether it contributed to death in a way that could be attributed to the retreat's regime. Survivor testimony became crucial because it spoke to control, not just outcome. A witness could describe the rules, the restrictions, the pressure to stay, the fear of leaving, the way hunger was explained, the way dissent was handled. This testimony moved the case beyond medical disagreement and toward authority, who decided, who enforced, and what happened when a patient resisted. Yet even survivor testimony had limits. Trauma does not produce neat timelines. Starvation fogs memory. Grief distorts recall. The defense can exploit every uncertainty, every inconsistent detail, every lack of precision. A survivor may be absolutely truthful and still be forced to look unreliable under hostile questioning. Courts often confuse messiness with dishonesty. They also prefer to treat consent as a single decision rather than a shifting condition. A person might choose to enter a retreat in hope. That does not mean they retain full freedom to leave once weakened, isolated, and persuaded that departure will kill them. But the law struggles with this kind of coercion because it does not look like a locked door. It looks like a mind pushed into a corner. The public, watching a case like this, often wants a simple moral: villain punished, victims avenged. The court, however, is also performing another function. It is reassuring the public that the system is capable of handling unusual harm without destabilizing everything around it. That reassurance encourages narrowing. It encourages treating the case as an aberration rather than a warning about how easily care can become coercive. This is why courts often sidestep broader questions. Is it acceptable to starve a patient to prove a theory? How should retreats be regulated when patients become dependent? What counts as confinement when a person is too weak to leave? These questions hover around the case, but they are not easily addressed in a single prosecution. They threaten to expand responsibility beyond one person. They threaten to implicate regulators, communities, and cultural beliefs. They threaten to make the case about the system rather than the offender. And systems are harder to put on trial. So the legal story becomes a story about one practitioner's actions, one patient's death, one set of decisions. It becomes small enough to punish. That smallness is not necessarily injustice. It is how the machinery works. But it has a cost. The cost is that the public can mistake punishment for resolution. In cases of private authority, punishment can occur without prevention. The conditions that enabled the harm remain in place. The appetite for certainty remains. The market for cures remains. Another retreat can open elsewhere, using remindfully similar language. This is how scandal is contained. Contained scandal becomes history as cautionary tale: a bad woman, a dangerous cure, a tragic death. It becomes less often what it truly is: an exposure of how trust can be weaponized when oversight is weak and people are desperate. The courtroom also reshapes victims. In court, victims become categories: complainant, witness, deceased. Their lives narrow to the details that support the case. Their hopes, fears, and daily suffering are either stripped away or reduced to a few key moments. This is not because anyone intends cruelty, but because legal process requires focus. Even so, the narrowing is another form of loss. The Williamson sisters' story was powerful because it forced the case into the open, but the court could not restore what Starvation Heights had taken. It could not rebuild bodies, reverse trauma, or repair trust. It could only judge, sentence, and close the file. Closing the file is one of the law's most soothing gestures. It allows a community to move on. But moving on is not the same as learning. Chapter 10. After the verdict. A verdict offers society a way to stop looking. Once a court has spoken, the story can be arranged into a familiar shape: wrongdoing identified, punishment delivered, danger addressed. The community exhales. Newspapers move on. Neighbors return to ordinary life. Even those who are uneasy about starvation heights can tell themselves that the matter has been handled. This is one of the law's quiet social functions. It provides a point of closure whether or not the underlying vulnerability has been repaired. In Hazzard's case, the verdict did not end the conditions that produced her authority. It marked a moment when those conditions were temporarily interrupted. The retreat had drawn power from three overlapping sources: cultural belief in fasting, the social prestige of natural cures, and the legal ambiguity that allowed alternative practitioners to operate with limited oversight. A conviction might damage a practitioner's reputation, but it does not automatically dismantle the belief system that sustained her. Nor does it necessarily stop a determined operator from continuing elsewhere, particularly if public memory fades and new patients arrive with fresh desperation. This is why the period after a verdict matters. It reveals what society chooses to remember and what it chooses to forget. Starvation Heights entered public imagination as scandal, but scandal has a short shelf life. It burns brightly and then is replaced by something newer. The deeper story, how care became coercion, requires sustained attention. Sustained attention is rare. For some observers, the case was absorbed into a moral lesson about quackery. Hazzard became an example of dangerous alternative medicine, a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong healer. That lesson is not false, but it is incomplete. It places responsibility primarily on individual judgment: choose better, be more skeptical, don't be fooled. The problem with this framing is that it ignores how vulnerability operates. People do not seek extreme cures because they are foolish. They seek them because they are unwell, frightened, and often failed by the ordinary systems of care. A culture that dismisses chronic suffering creates a market for certainty. A market for certainty produces operators who promise the impossible. Punishing an operator does not eliminate the market. It simply rearranges it. Another set of observers treated the case as moral theater. A woman who styled herself as a doctor, who controlled other bodies, who breached expected norms of feminine care, could be framed as an aberration: unnatural, predatory, wicked. In this interpretation, punishment restores moral order. The dangerous woman is removed, and society can reassure itself that proper boundaries still hold. This framing, too, is comforting and incomplete. It protects gender norms more than it protects patients. The most important question after the verdict is practical: what changed on the ground? Did regulators act differently? Did local communities develop clearer pathways for intervention? Did the medical profession treat desperate patients with more seriousness? Did the public become more cautious about retreats that demanded isolation and obedience? In many historical cases, the answer is that changes were modest at best. Scandal can produce short-term reforms, but those reforms often weaken over time. The market adapts. Language shifts. Practitioners rebrand. Patients continue to seek help. This pattern is not unique to Hazzard. It is part of a broader history of care industries, in which oversight struggles to keep pace with desperation. It is also why Hazzard's story continued beyond the courtroom. Her name remained infamous in some circles, yet fame and infamy are not reliable barriers. A practitioner can relocate, operate under different framing, or find new audiences who have not heard the story. And even among those who have heard it, belief can override warning. People often assume that they will be the exception, that they will recognize danger in time, that they will not be controlled. Starvation does not announce itself as control. It announces itself as discipline. This is the most unsettling aspect of the aftermath, that the mechanisms of harm are so easily repackaged as virtue. Hunger becomes cleansing. Weakness becomes proof. Isolation becomes focus. Obedience becomes commitment. Even the language of retreat is protective. It suggests rest, restoration, and privacy. It makes intervention feel intrusive. When a retreat frames itself as wellness, outsiders hesitate. They do not want to interfere with a person's choice to pursue health. They do not want to be seen as cruel skeptics. Predatory systems thrive in that hesitation. For survivors and families, the aftermath is rarely closure. A verdict does not repair trust. It does not undo the self-doubt that coercive care creates. It does not remove the shame many victims carry for having believed. In cases involving alternative medicine, that shame can be particularly intense because the public often responds with judgment rather than compassion. Victims are asked, "Why did you stay? Why didn't you leave? Why did you believe her?" These questions misunderstand what dependence does. They assume that consent is stable and that leaving is always possible. They ignore how isolation and hunger reduce capacity to act. They ignore how authority can be internalized until a patient feels guilty for resisting. A system that produces shame in victims protects itself. After the verdict, Starvation Heights remained in memory in uneven ways. Some remembered it as a horror story. Some remembered it as gossip. Some forgot it entirely. What was least remembered, and most important, was the structure, the way a private care setting could function as a closed world, and the way law could arrive only after harm became undeniable. The lesson was available. Society's willingness to learn it was limited. Chapter 11, The Afterlife of Starvation Heights. A scandal does not survive unchanged. It survives in the shape that culture finds easiest to repeat. After the verdict, Starvation Heights became a story people knew, even when they did not know the details. It turned into shorthand, the place where a woman starved her patients, the retreat that promised healing and delivered death. In some retellings, it became almost gothic, a remote property, skeletal figures, a sinister healer. In others, it became moral instruction about quackery, a warning against alternative medicine and gullibility. Both versions are true enough to circulate. Neither is sufficient. The most important thing Starvation Heights offered was not a sensational tale. It was an exposure of how care can become coercion when authority is private and oversight is weak. Yet that structural lesson is harder to keep alive than a monster story. Monsters are easy to recognize. Systems are easy to ignore. So the story drifted toward the monstrous. Linda Hazzard was increasingly framed as a singular villain, the dangerous woman, the fraudulent doctor, the predator who used starvation as a weapon. Some of this framing is understandable. The harm was real, and anger is not misplaced. But the singular villain narrative does cultural work beyond condemnation. It protects the audience from implication. If one woman was uniquely wicked, then the broader world is safe. A structural narrative, by contrast, is unsettling. It asks why her methods were credible in the first place. It asks why patients stayed. It asks why locals did not intervene. It asks why regulators allowed alternative credentials to function as legitimacy. It asks why women's pain and chronic illness were so often dismissed that a fasting retreat could look like salvation. Those questions are more difficult to package into gossip. They demand attention, not merely reaction. This is why the afterlife of Starvation Heights often emphasize the dramatic details. Emaciated bodies seen in town. Rumors of labor and confinement. The eerie isolation of the property. The death of a wealthy patient and the survival of her sister. These elements are memorable. They also risk reducing victims to scenery in a story about a compelling villain. When victims become scenery, their suffering becomes a narrative tool rather than a human reality. A serious account must resist that. There is also a predictable modern tendency to psychologize Hazzard. Later writers sometimes describe her as sadistic, mentally ill, or driven by cruelty. Those explanations can be emotionally satisfying because they provide a single cause. She did this because she was that kind of person. But the historical record does not support a confident interior portrait. What it supports is something more useful, a portrait of a role. Hazzard occupied the role of healer in a culture ready to believe. She benefited from a marketplace that rewarded certainty. She operated within legal gray zones. She maintained authority through deprivation and interpretation. This is not a psychological profile. It is a structural one. The structural portrait is harder to sensationalize because it implicates ordinary mechanisms, the way people defer to authority, the way desperation lowers resistance, the way private businesses resist oversight. It is also more likely to prevent repetition because it offers actionable recognition. The warning signs are not supernatural. They are procedural. Isolation. Restricted access to food. Suppression of outside voices. Dependence framed as treatment. Money managed by the authority figure. Decline reinterpreted as progress. These signs can appear in many settings, not only in retreats. They can appear in private homes, residential programs, religious communities, and wellness industries of all kinds. Starvation Heights is one historical instance of a recurring pattern. The afterlife of the story also reveals something about how society perceives wellness culture. Wellness narratives often promise that suffering is meaningful. No pain, no gain is not only a fitness slogan, it is a broader moral idea. People accept discomfort as evidence of improvement. This idea is not inherently harmful. It becomes harmful when discomfort crosses into injury and when injury is reinterpreted as virtue. Starvation Heights exploited that boundary. After the scandal, many people responded by drawing a different boundary, not between discomfort and harm, but between real medicine and fake medicine. That boundary is easier to defend because it allows clear sorting. It tells people to avoid the wrong kind of practitioner. Yet sorting does not solve the deeper vulnerability. Even within orthodox medicine, authority can become coercive if patients are not listened to. Even within regulated systems, profit can distort care. Even within professional settings, marginalized patients can be dismissed until they seek answers elsewhere. The point is not that alternative medicine is uniquely dangerous. The point is that any system of care becomes dangerous when it cannot be questioned. Starvation Heights became famous because it was extreme. Extremity makes it memorable. It also makes it easy to dismiss as rare. This is another function of monster stories. They imply that ordinary life is safe because it is not that. But ordinary life contains quieter versions of the same dynamic. A person is told their suffering is imaginary. They find someone who takes them seriously. That person offers certainty. Certainty demands obedience. Obedience becomes control. This sequence is not confined to the past. It is also why the Williamson sisters remain so central in retellings. Their story makes the case legible because it fits a narrative of social visibility, wealthy foreigners, tragic death, survivor testimony, courtroom drama. The danger is that focusing solely on them can obscure those whose deaths were easier to dismiss, whose suffering remained private, whose families lacked the means to force attention. The record tilts toward the visible. History must notice that tilt. In the chapters that follow, the book returns deliberately to what the afterlife often avoids: regulation, consent, and the politics of credibility. It asks what it meant for a woman to claim medical authority in that era, how the state attempted to define legitimate practice, and why choice became such a powerful shield for harm in private health settings. Starvation Heights is remembered because it is disturbing. It should also be remembered because it is instructive. Chapter 12: Gender, Credibility, and the Performance of Care. Linda Hazzard's authority was never purely medical. It was social. She operated in a period when women's public authority was expanding but still contested, and the figure of a woman calling herself doctor carried a particular charge. For some patients, a woman healer promised gentleness where male doctors had offered dismissal. For others, a woman practicing outside orthodox medicine confirmed anxieties about fraud and overreach. These tensions did not sit neatly outside her case, they shaped it from beginning to end. Gender helped Hazzard gain trust. Gender also shaped the way she was punished. In the early 20th century, women were widely expected to be caretakers. Even when women held power, it was often power that could be framed as natural: managing a home, tending the sick, guiding the moral order of a household. Wellness culture leaned on these assumptions. It marketed retreats as places of nurturing discipline, where bodies could be set right through routines that resembled domestic order. Hazzard's retreat drew authority from that domestic register. Patients did not enter an institution that looked like a hospital with its harsh lights and clinical detachment. They entered a setting that could be presented as calm, ordered, and personal. The language of care softened the reality of control. Restrictions could be framed as responsible supervision. Isolation could be framed as protection from stress. Labor could be framed as wholesome routine. In such a setting, authority can hide behind the appearance of attentive management. This is why the performance of care matters. Care is not only what is done. It is how what is done is presented. In coercive care settings, presentation can be as powerful as practice. A patient may be harmed while being spoken to gently, praised for discipline, and told they are progressing. The tone of compassion can mask the reality of deprivation. For many people, especially those failed by previous doctors. This tone is intoxicating. It does not feel like violence. It feels like someone finally taking you seriously. Hazzard's gender may have made that performance easier to accept. A woman enforcing discipline could be framed as maternal rather than punitive. Restrictions could be interpreted as protection rather than domination. Patients accustomed to being treated as fragile might find comfort in a firm, confident woman who claimed she could restore them. Yet the same cultural assumptions that enabled trust could reverse sharply once scandal erupted. When the retreat became publicly associated with starvation and death, Hazzard could be recast as the bad woman in an instantly recognizable form, the unnatural carer, the woman who betrayed the role she was meant to embody. This recasting is a common feature of cases where harm emerges from spaces culturally coded as feminine or domestic. A male doctor harming patients can be framed as arrogance, greed, or professional corruption. A female healer harming patients is often framed as betrayal of womanhood itself. This betrayal framing adds heat to public outrage. It also simplifies the story. It encourages a focus on personality rather than structure. It invites audiences to treat Hazzard as a deviant individual rather than as a product of a marketplace that rewarded certainty and tolerated coercion when dressed in the language of health. It becomes easy to say, she was a fraud, and stop there. But fraud is not the only question. Even if Hazzard sincerely believed in fasting, sincerity does not prevent harm. Belief can be dangerous when it is paired with authority and a captive audience. The more important issue is not whether she believed, but why belief in her cure was plausible, why oversight was weak, and why patients could be kept in a state of dependence without immediate intervention. These are structural questions. Gender shaped how they were answered, but it did not remove them. Gender also shaped credibility in court. In legal proceedings, a woman in authority can be treated as both less credible and more suspicious. She may be assumed to be emotionally unstable, manipulative, or deceptive. At the same time, her performance of care can make her seem harmless and respectable. These competing assumptions do not cancel each other out. They create a complicated field in which perception matters. A defendant who can present as composed, nurturing, and principled may benefit from the cultural belief that women are naturally caring. A defendant who is framed as predatory may be condemned more harshly for violating that belief. Both dynamics can operate simultaneously, depending on the audience. Victims and witnesses, too, are judged through gender. Women's testimony about illness has historically been discounted, especially when symptoms are chronic, invisible, or difficult to prove. This discounting is part of what drives people toward alternative cures. When such women later testify about harm, their accounts can again be treated with skepticism. They are asked whether they exaggerated, whether they misunderstood, whether they were hysterical, whether they consented. Consent becomes a weapon against female credibility. A woman who sought an alternative cure can be framed as foolish, vain, or unstable. She can be blamed for her own vulnerability. This blame not only harms survivors, it protects the systems that failed them in the first place. It suggests that the real problem is women making poor choices, rather than institutions dismissing women's pain until desperation makes extreme choices seem reasonable. In the Hazzard case, the Williamson sisters' social position helped shield them from some of this dismissal, but not all of it. Their wealth and education made their suffering harder to ignore, yet their participation in a fasting cure could still be framed as eccentricity. The court's willingness to recognize harm was influenced not only by evidence but by the victim's legibility to authority. This is an uncomfortable truth: not all victims are equally believable in the public imagination. Hazzard's own self-fashioning exploited gender in another way, through professional mimicry. By claiming the title of doctor, publishing, and operating a sanitarium, she borrowed the appearance of institutional authority. Yet she also retained the aura of personal, almost domestic care that made alternative practitioners attractive. She sat at the intersection of two forms of trust, the trust placed in credentials and the trust placed in a caring woman. That intersection is powerful. It is also risky, because it can allow authority to operate without the checks that usually accompany formal medicine. The patient receives the weight of expertise without the protections of oversight. Starvation Heights shows how easily this can happen. It also shows that scandal tends to produce a particular kind of reaction. Rather than examining the vulnerability of systems, society reaches for moral sorting. The bad woman is identified. The good women are reassured. The broader machinery is left largely untouched. Chapter 13, loopholes, licenses, and the thin wall of regulation. Linda Hazzard did not build starvation heights in defiance of the state. She built it in the gaps the state left open. This is one of the most unsettling elements of her story. It is tempting to imagine her operating entirely outside legitimacy, a rogue practitioner on the fringe, hidden from authority. The reality is more ordinary and therefore more dangerous. Hazzard's authority was supported, at least initially, by the appearance of legality. She was able to present herself as a licensed practitioner in an environment where the line between medicine and healing was not consistently policed. A license, even a weak one, changes everything. It gives a patient permission to trust. It gives a community permission to hesitate. It gives a practitioner a shield against scrutiny. Patients seeking help are not usually equipped to parse the fine print of professional regulation. They respond to signals. A license is one of the strongest signals available. It suggests oversight, standards, and accountability, even when those things are minimal. In early 20th century America, medical regulation was uneven and in transition. The boundaries between orthodox medicine, naturopathy, sanitarium culture, and dietary reform were porous. Alternative healers could operate through loopholes, sympathetic local authorities, or ambiguous credentials that did not meet modern expectations of medical training. Hazzard's case sits squarely inside this transition period. This chapter is not an argument that regulation would have prevented every harm. It is an examination of why regulations struggled to recognize harm in the first place. The state was not only dealing with a practitioner. It was dealing with an ideology that claimed to be health, and a marketplace that framed treatment as personal choice. Choice is one of the most powerful shields in private care settings. If an adult chooses to fast, authorities hesitate to intervene. If an adult chooses to stay in a retreat, authorities hesitate further. If an adult signs papers agreeing to treatment, the retreat gains legal cover. The law is wary of paternalism. It is wary of infringing on bodily autonomy. It is wary of punishing unconventional belief. These are not necessarily bad instincts. They become dangerous when they are applied without recognizing coercion. Coercion in starvation heights was not always visible as force. It was visible as dependence. A patient who is starved becomes weaker. A weaker patient becomes less capable of leaving. A less capable patient becomes more reliant on the authority who controls the environment. This is coercion enacted through conditions rather than chains. Most regulatory frameworks are poorly designed to detect that kind of coercion, especially when the setting is privately owned and framed as therapeutic. The retreat also benefited from the prestige of the sanitarium model. Sanitariums and health resorts were common in that era. They blended medical treatment with lifestyle discipline. They marketed fresh air, quiet, routine, and dietary reform. Many were legitimate, some were not, and the general public did not always distinguish clearly between them. A retreat was not automatically suspicious. It was, in fact, fashionable. Fashion is a form of protection. If health retreats are culturally coded as wholesome, then concerns about them are easier to dismiss as ignorance or prejudice. Critics can be framed as old-fashioned, fearful, or unsophisticated. Patients can be framed as brave seekers of modern health. This framing makes regulation harder because the retreat is not operating against social values. It is operating through them. Hazzard also benefited from the fact that starvation is often misrecognized. Starvation is a condition, but it can be disguised as a choice. Weight loss can be praised rather than questioned. Discipline can be celebrated. Suffering can be romanticized as purification. In a culture that values restraint, a starved body can be misread as a virtuous body. This cultural misrecognition is part of why the retreat could persist. Even when patients appeared emaciated, observers could tell themselves that the patients were committed, that the cure was intense, that the person was doing something extreme but voluntary. The retreat did not need to hide the outcomes entirely. It needed only to keep the interpretation ambiguous. Ambiguity is a powerful defense. Regulation also struggles when evidence is private. What happens in a retreat is not easily witnessed. Unless a patient complains and is believed, or a death triggers formal inquiry, the state has little access. Inspections, if they exist, are often limited. Practitioners can present their facilities at their best. Patients, already weakened and dependent, may be coached in what to say. In coercive settings, Even truthful patients can sound uncertain. Starvation affects cognition. Trauma affects memory. Fear affects speech. The very people most able to describe the harm are those least able to perform the kind of calm, coherent credibility that authorities prefer. This credibility gap is structural. It is not a flaw in victims. It is a flaw in the way institutions judge truth. Hazzard's retreat also demonstrates another regulatory problem. Belief-based treatment can be framed as disagreement rather than danger. If a practitioner says, "I believe fasting cures illness," authorities may treat the issue as one of medical debate. Unless there is clear evidence of harm, the practitioner's claim can be dismissed as misguided rather than criminal. This is how extreme practices survive. They embed themselves in controversies that have no simple legal resolution, until someone dies in a way the law cannot ignore. Even then, the response is often narrow. It punishes the case at hand and leaves the broader ecosystem intact. That ecosystem includes not only laws, but cultural conditions, distrust of medicine, hunger for certainty, and the moral value placed on discipline. This is why Starvation Heights is best understood as a convergence. A woman with authority. A culture receptive to fasting. A regulatory environment full of gaps. Patients desperate for solutions. A retreat that isolated and controlled. Remove any one of these factors, and the harm may have been limited. Together, they produced an institution capable of sustaining starvation while calling it care. Chapter 14, The Shrinking World. A retreat does not need to build walls to become a prison. It only needs to narrow the world until leaving feels impossible. This narrowing happened at Starvation Heights through a combination of isolation, routine, weakness, and interpretation. Each element alone might have looked harmless, even therapeutic. Together, they created a closed environment in which patients' options, voices, and realities steadily reduced. The first narrowing was geographical. Olala offered distance. Distance was marketed as healing, quiet, fresh air, escape from urban stress. For patients arriving from elsewhere, that distance was reassuring. It suggested a place set apart from the noise and confusion of ordinary life. Yet distance also meant separation from allies. It meant fewer unexpected visitors and fewer opportunities for casual escape. It meant the retreat could control access. Distance is always political. It decides who can arrive and who can intervene. The second narrowing was social. Patients entered the retreat as individuals, often separated from family and friends. Once inside, their relationships were mediated through the retreat's rules and culture. Concern from outside could be reframed as interference. Warnings could be described as ignorance. Loved ones who questioned the cure could be portrayed as undermining recovery. If a patient was already desperate, this reframing could take hold quickly. A person who has been unwell for years may be used to disappointment and skepticism from others. If family have grown tired of hearing about symptoms, or if doctors have dismissed them, the patient may already feel misunderstood. A practitioner who offers certainty can exploit that loneliness. The retreat becomes the place where the patient finally feels seen. Outside voices then become not support, but threat. This is how isolation becomes voluntary. People choose it because it feels like safety. The third narrowing was cognitive. Starvation changes the mind. Hunger produces fatigue, irritability, fog, and a reduced capacity for complex thought. It narrows attention to immediate survival. It makes planning difficult. It makes decision-making exhausting. It also increases dependence on simple narratives and on trusted authority figures. This cognitive narrowing is one reason coercive systems can persist without physical force. The body's decline becomes the mechanism through which resistance is made harder. A weakened person is less able to argue. A fatigued person is less able to plan. A hungry person is less able to risk conflict. Even if escape is technically possible, it becomes practically overwhelming. The fourth narrowing was interpretive. Hazzard's cure offered an explanation for every form of distress. Hunger was cleansing. Weakness was progress. Fear was resistance. Confusion was toxin leaving the body. In a closed system, such explanations can become total. They crowd out competing interpretations until the patient loses the ability to assess what is happening in ordinary terms. If suffering is always reframed as healing, the patient cannot easily name harm. Naming harm is the beginning of escape. If you cannot name it, you cannot object to it clearly, and you cannot convincingly describe it to others. You may feel dread, but dread without language can be turned inward as shame. Shame is one of the most efficient tools of containment. A patient who feels ashamed for failing the cure is less likely to seek outside help. A patient who believes they are weak or morally flawed is less likely to accuse the practitioner. The retreat's moral framing, discipline as virtue, appetite as failure, encouraged patients to interpret their own distress as personal inadequacy. This is how an institution can harm people while persuading them to blame themselves. The retreat also used routine to reinforce narrowing. Routine can be comforting. It reduces anxiety by removing choices. In places that market care, routine looks like stability, set times, set practices, a structured day. Yet routine can also prevent private thought. It keeps patients occupied, monitored, and emotionally contained. It reduces opportunities for confidential conversation with other patients. It allows the practitioner to control the pace of the day and the flow of information. In a closed world, information is as important as food. Patients need to know whether others are improving. They need to know whether deterioration is common. They need to know whether anyone has left safely. If that information is restricted, each patient remains alone inside their own experience. They may suspect harm, but they cannot easily confirm it. Without confirmation, doubt can feel like paranoia. This is one reason closed systems often discourage solidarity. Solidarity is dangerous to authority. It creates shared language. It creates shared plans. It creates shared refusal. If patients are kept isolated from one another, they cannot easily form a collective understanding of what is happening. Each person becomes a private problem to be managed. The retreat's shrinking world also made the outside world feel distant and unsafe. A patient being told repeatedly that ordinary food is dangerous, that outside doctors are ignorant, and that leaving will destroy the cure may begin to fear the world beyond the property. Fear strengthens captivity. It makes the retreat seem like the only safe option, even when it is clearly harming the body. In this way, the retreat becomes psychologically self-sealing. The more a patient weakens, the more they depend. The more they depend, the more they accept the narrative. The more they accept the narrative, the less they seek outside help. The less they seek outside help, the more the system continues. This cycle can persist for months. It can persist until death. Locals noticing emaciated patients in town is a small crack in this cycle. It shows that the retreat did not always fully contain its subjects. Patients sometimes moved through public space. But the fact that this did not produce immediate intervention highlights another aspect of the shrinking world. Outsiders may see the body, but not the system. A skeletal person can be interpreted in many ways. They might be ill. They might be on a cure. They might be voluntarily fasting. They might be eccentric. Without knowledge of coercion, the sight alone does not necessarily trigger action. Concern becomes gossip. Gossip becomes folklore. Folklore rarely becomes legal intervention until a survivor speaks. The shrinking world, then, was not only inside the retreat. It extended outward through ambiguity. It relied on the community's uncertainty about what it was seeing and on the state's hesitation to intrude into a private health enterprise. Starvation Heights demonstrates that captivity can be maintained without overt violence if the system controls essentials, controls interpretation, and keeps those inside too weak to challenge it. Chapter 15. The break in the narrative. Closed systems do not collapse because harm occurs. They collapse when harm can no longer be explained. At Starvation Heights, explanation was the retreat's strongest defense. Linda Hazzard's method relied on a narrative that could absorb suffering and recast it as progress. Hunger became cleansing. Weakness became purification. Fear became resistance. Even death could, at times, be folded into the story as the tragic failure of a body too damaged to recover. As long as this narrative held, the retreat could continue. The arrival of the Williamson sisters strained that narrative, and the death of Claire Williamson broke it. The Williamson sisters were not the first patients to weaken. They were not the first to deteriorate. But their social position changed the stakes. Their lives were connected to a world that was more likely to notice, more likely to demand answers, and more likely to treat an unexplained death as unacceptable. Visibility is a form of protection. It is also a trigger for accountability. Claire and Dora entered the retreat as hopeful patients. Once inside, they were pulled into the same shrinking world as everyone else. Food restriction tightened. Control deepened. The cure's logic was repeated until it became the only explanation available. As the sisters weakened, their capacity to resist decreased. Their ability to interpret their own condition independently eroded. This is how the narrative becomes internal. A patient may begin by tolerating hunger because she believes it is temporary. She may continue because she is told it is necessary. She may persist because she is frightened of failure. Eventually, she may no longer be able to assess whether she is improving or dying. She can only follow instructions. For Claire Williamson, this progression ended in death. Death is always a rupture. But in closed systems, a rupture can be managed if it is framed properly. The retreat's logic could describe Claire's death as unavoidable, as proof of prior illness, as evidence that she arrived too late to be saved. This is not merely spin. It is ideology doing its work. Ideology offers a ready-made explanation that protects authority from scrutiny. It allows a practitioner to maintain certainty even when the body proves otherwise. It also allows patients and staff to avoid confronting the possibility that they have participated in harm. If the death is framed as unfortunate but natural, no one must change anything. The problem in this case was Dora Williamson. Dora survived. She was weakened and grieving, but she was alive. That single fact changed the shape of the story. A dead patient can be described. A living patient can contradict. A dead patient can be framed as failure. A survivor can describe the system that produced the failure. Survivors are dangerous to predatory care settings because they carry two kinds of evidence at once: bodily evidence and narrative evidence. The body can show what happened. The voice can explain how it happened. Dora could speak about restriction, pressure, and control. She could describe the retreat's interpretation of suffering and the ways that interpretation was enforced. She could articulate what was previously held inside the retreat's private world. She could also connect the dots between harm and benefit, between bodily decline and the retreat's continued operation. Even if every detail could not be proven beyond doubt, the narrative itself mattered. It made the harm legible. Legibility is the bridge between private suffering and public action. Before Dora's testimony, what existed outside Starvation Heights was rumor, sightings, local talk, uneasy stories. Rumor can persist for years without consequence because it is amorphous. It cannot easily be prosecuted. It can always be dismissed as exaggeration. A survivor turns rumor into allegation. That transformation forces choices. Authorities must decide whether to ignore, investigate, or intervene. Communities must decide whether to continue treating the retreat as eccentric or to treat it as dangerous. The public must decide whether to see victims as foolish participants in a fad or as people captured by a system that exploited desperation. These decisions are rarely purely rational. They are shaped by class, gender, and the politics of credibility. In Dora Williamson's case, credibility was bolstered by her background. She was not easily written off as a drifter or a local nobody. She was educated, connected, and recognizable as respectable. That respectability helped force attention. This should not comfort us. It should trouble us, because it suggests that harm becomes actionable not when it is most extreme, but when it touches people whose voices carry weight. The retreat's earlier victims mattered. Their suffering was real. The structure that allowed their suffering to continue remained intact until a case emerged that could not be absorbed into silence. The break, then, was not simply a death. It was a death that pierced the retreat's protective ambiguity. Starvation Heights relied on the idea that what happened there was private. It relied on the idea that patients were consenting adults pursuing health. It relied on the idea that unusual treatment was a matter of personal choice. Dora's testimony disrupted that framing. It suggested that choice had been compromised by dependence and that care had become control. Once that suggestion took hold, the retreat story could no longer stand unchallenged. The narrative break also exposed another uncomfortable truth. The retreat had power not only over patients but over meaning. It taught people how to interpret their own suffering. It created a language in which hunger was virtue and weakness was progress. Dora's survival allowed a competing language to emerge: hunger as harm, weakness as warning, isolation as coercion. Competing language is the beginning of accountability. Without it, Closed systems remain closed. Chapter 16. Translating harm into evidence. Once Starvation Heights became a matter for authorities, the problem shifted from knowing that something was wrong to proving what, exactly, had happened. This is the point where many cases of private authority falter. People can feel harm. They can witness decline. They can hear rumors and see bodies that do not look right. But institutions do not act on feeling. They act on evidence, and evidence has rules. Those rules do not always align with human experience. At Starvation Heights, the harm was slow and cumulative. It was not a single dramatic act witnessed by many. It was a regime, repeated deprivation, repeated reinterpretation, repeated dependence. The body failed over time, and the retreat's narrative absorbed each stage of failure as part of the cure. To prosecute a regime, the law prefers to isolate events. What did the patient eat? How much did she weigh? What treatment was administered? Who made which decision, and when? What was the immediate cause of death? These questions turn lived suffering into measurable fragments. They also risk missing the central truth, that the regime itself was the harm. This is why the first institutional response is often narrow. Officials look for the easiest provable offense rather than the most accurate description of the system. Starvation also complicates proof because it can hide behind prior illness. Many people who sought Hazzard's care were already unwell. That is why they arrived. This gives the defense a ready argument. They were sick before they came, they were fragile, they might have died anyway. In a courtroom, might have can be powerful. It introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is a defense. So the prosecution must show not only that the patient died, but that the retreat's regime contributed materially to that death. This requires medical testimony, records, witnesses, and sometimes inferences drawn from what is missing. Missing records matter. A retreat that controls access also controls documentation. If notes are incomplete, the gaps themselves become suspicious. Yet gaps are difficult to prosecute unless they can be linked to intent. A practitioner can claim poor record-keeping, confusion, or difference in practice. Unless an institution requires certain standards, absence becomes difficult to treat as wrongdoing. This is one reason weak regulation makes later accountability harder. Without rules, there is no clear breach. Witness testimony therefore becomes central. Survivors can describe what they were told. Staff can describe routines and restrictions. Neighbors can describe bodies seen in town. Friends and family can describe the patient's decline after contact with the retreat. Each witness provides a fragment of the system. Together, those fragments can form a pattern. But patterns are fragile in court. The defense will attempt to break them into separate stories. This witness is mistaken. That witness is biased. This description is exaggerated. That detail is inconsistent. Courts often treat inconsistency as unreliability rather than as a normal feature of trauma and deprivation. Starvation affects memory. Weakness affects clarity. Fear affects narrative. A survivor who speaks in a disorganized way is not necessarily lying. She may simply be recovering from a period in which her body and mind were under stress. Yet the courtroom rewards calm coherence. It rewards the kind of story that can be told cleanly. This is a structural advantage for the practitioner. Practitioners are usually well-fed, rested, and practiced in persuasion. They are familiar with authority. They have rehearsed explanations. They can present themselves as composed and principled. The contrast between a composed defendant and a trembling survivor can tilt perception even when the survivor is telling the truth. The court becomes not only a place of facts, but a theater of credibility. In cases involving alternative medicine, this theater is intensified by public ambivalence. Many people are sympathetic to unconventional cures. Many people distrust orthodox medicine. Many people believe that personal choice should be respected. These beliefs create a cultural atmosphere in which prosecuting an alternative healer can look like an attack on freedom. The prosecution must therefore do more than prove harm. It must persuade the public that harm was not merely the result of an unlucky outcome, but of misconduct. Misconduct is a key word here. It allows the law to condemn the practitioner without condemning every alternative practice. It draws a boundary. The cure itself might be debated, but the way it was enforced was wrongful. This boundary is often where courts settle because it is socially manageable. It allows people to keep believing in choice and personal responsibility while still punishing a particularly visible case. Starvation Heights force the court to consider what choice means in a closed care environment. A patient may enter voluntarily, but what happens when the patient becomes too weak to leave? What happens when she is told that eating will kill her? What happens when she is isolated from support? What happens when her money and correspondence are controlled? These questions point toward coercion. Yet coercion without chains remains difficult to prove. The court may recognize the atmosphere, but atmospheres are not charges. They must be converted into specific allegations: neglect, unlawful restraint, fraud, manslaughter. This is the law's fundamental limitation in cases like this. It can punish acts, but it struggles to punish systems. Even when a practitioner is convicted, the conviction often rests on one death, one set of circumstances, one identifiable breach. The broader regime may remain outside the formal judgment even if everyone in the courtroom understands it. That gap between understanding and judgment is where private authority often survives. Starvation Heights also illustrates how evidence is shaped by social standing. The Williamson sisters' case carried weight because it could attract attention and resources. Their wealth and background made their suffering legible to authorities. It did not guarantee justice, but it made investigation more likely. This is an uncomfortable truth. Some victims produce evidence that institutions can recognize more readily than others. The retreat's earlier victims, especially those without social power, were less likely to generate the kind of documentation and pressure that forces institutional action. Their suffering was real, but the system had fewer reasons to translate it into evidence. The process of translation, then, is never neutral. It is shaped by class, credibility, and the state's interest in containing scandal without destabilizing broader belief. Chapter 17. Containing the scandal. Once harm has been translated into evidence and judged, a second process begins. This process is quieter and more cultural. It is the work of containment. Containment is not denial. It is not forgetting. It is the shaping of memory so that a disturbing event can be absorbed without requiring deep change. A scandal that cannot be contained threatens confidence in institutions, markets, and everyday choices. A scandal that is contained becomes a cautionary tale with clear edges and limited implications. Starvation Heights was contained quickly. The public story that emerged after the trial emphasized spectacle over structure. It focused on the shock of starvation, the horror of emaciated bodies, and the personality of the woman at the center. Linda Hazzard became the main object of attention. Her actions, her beliefs, her punishment. The retreat itself faded into the background, treated as an extension of her rather than as a system that could be reproduced elsewhere. This framing did important work. By locating the danger in one person, the wider culture could reassure itself that the problem had been removed. The public did not need to ask why fasting cures were popular, why regulation was weak, or why patients could be isolated and controlled without intervention. It did not need to examine how desperation and trust interact. It needed only to agree that this woman had gone too far. Containment also relied on language. The retreat was described as extreme, bizarre, or aberrant. Its practices were portrayed as unusual rather than as intensified versions of ideas already circulating widely. This allowed wellness culture to distance itself from the case. Ordinary dieting, fasting, and discipline could continue untroubled. The scandal was framed as an exception, not a warning. Exception stories are comforting. They imply rarity. Media accounts played their part by leaning into vivid detail. Emaciation was described graphically. The setting was portrayed as eerie. The contrast between promise and outcome was emphasized. These elements made the story memorable, but they also encouraged readers to experience it as horror rather than analysis. Horror provokes reaction. Analysis provokes responsibility. The more Starvation Heights was treated as a grotesque curiosity, the less it needed to be understood as a product of ordinary cultural forces. The audience could shudder and move on. The lesson remained shallow: don't trust obvious charlatans. The deeper lesson, that harm can flourish under the language of care, was easier to ignore. Containment also occurred through moral sorting. Victims were described as tragic but naive. They were pitted, but often subtly blamed for seeking unconventional treatment. This blame did not need to be explicit. It could appear as raised eyebrows, incredulous commentary, or rhetorical questions about why anyone would agree to such a cure. This response serves a protective function. If victims are framed as unusually foolish, the audience can reassure itself that it would never make the same mistake. That reassurance reduces anxiety but obscures vulnerability. It ignores the fact that many patients arrived at starvation heights after being failed repeatedly by orthodox medicine. It ignores how desperation narrows choice. It ignores how authority can feel like relief when suffering has gone unrecognized. Blaming victims makes the system look safer than it is. Containment also occurred through professional distancing. Medical authorities could condemn Hazzard without fully examining their own profession's role in creating the conditions she exploited. They could point to her lack of orthodox credentials and treat the case as an indictment of alternative medicine rather than as a reminder of how often patients turn to alternatives because mainstream care dismissed them. This allowed the medical establishment to emerge as the corrective force rather than as part of the story. Such distancing is understandable. Institutions protect themselves. But it leaves the underlying vulnerability untouched. Patients whose pain is minimized will continue to look elsewhere. Markets for certainty will continue to thrive where uncertainty is not handled with care. The law, too, benefited from containment. By focusing on one conviction, it could present itself as responsive and just. It did not need to confront how difficult it was to intervene earlier, or how many warning signs were missed because the retreat operated in a private gray zone. The verdict became proof of function rather than a prompt for reform. Containment is effective because it feels like closure. But closure is often an illusion. The ideas that sustained starvation heights did not disappear. Fasting continued to be promoted. Retreats continued to operate. People continued to seek cures that promised control over bodies that felt unpredictable and frightening. The contained story travels forward, stripped of its most challenging questions. This is why returning to cases like Hazzard's matters. Not to relive horror, but to reopen what was closed too neatly. To ask what was made invisible by the rush to conclude. To recognize that containment protects comfort more than it protects people. Chapter 18, The Persistence of the Cure. Starvation Heights no longer exists as a place, but its logic has not vanished. It persists because the conditions that made it plausible have not disappeared. They have merely changed shape. Modern readers are often tempted to treat cases like Linda Hazzard's as artifacts of a less enlightened past. The fasting cure can look crude, even absurd, when viewed through contemporary medical knowledge. Yet focusing on the strangeness of the method misses the more durable lesson. The danger did not lie in fasting alone. It lay in how certainty, authority, and vulnerability were organized around it. That organization remains familiar. People still seek cures that promise clarity where medicine offers complexity. They still turn to practitioners who speak confidently and act decisively when others hesitate. They still accept suffering as evidence of progress when that suffering is framed as necessary. And they still enter private spaces of care where oversight is limited and choice is quietly reshaped by dependence. What has changed is the language. Where Hazzard spoke of toxins and fasting, modern wellness culture speaks of detoxification, inflammation, optimization, and reset. Where her retreat promised purification through deprivation, contemporary programs promise transformation through discipline. The vocabulary has updated, but the moral structure is strikingly similar. Pain is still reframed as proof. Endurance is still praised as commitment. Doubt is still framed as weakness. This continuity matters because it shows that Starvation Heights was not a historical anomaly. It was an early visible expression of a recurring pattern in the economics of care. The wellness market thrives on the idea that health is a personal responsibility that can be mastered with the right method. This idea can be empowering, but it can also be weaponized. When responsibility is pushed entirely onto the individual, systems are relieved of accountability. If a cure fails, the patient is told they did not commit hard enough, believe deeply enough, or follow the rules precisely enough. This logic protected Hazzard. It continues to protect others. Private care settings remain particularly vulnerable to abuse because they sit at the intersection of choice and isolation. They are often entered voluntarily, but once entered, they can restrict information, control routine, and shape interpretation. Patients may not be physically restrained, but they can still be functionally trapped by weakness, fear, and belief. The law continues to struggle with this kind of harm. Regulation is better than it was in Hazzard's time, but it remains reactive. It responds to deaths, lawsuits, and public scandals. It is less effective at addressing slow harm, cumulative neglect, or psychological coercion. The emphasis on consent remains strong, even when consent is compromised by dependence. This is not a failure of compassion. It is a failure of imagination. Institutions often imagine coercion as something dramatic and visible. They struggle to recognize it when it appears as guidance, routine, or care. They struggle to accept that people can be controlled through deprivation without overt force. Starvation Heights demonstrates how easily that control can be normalized. It also demonstrates how gendered expectations continue to shape trust. Practitioners who present themselves as nurturing, holistic, or intuitive may benefit from assumptions that soften scrutiny. At the same time, when harm is exposed, gender can be used to personalize and contain the scandal, framing it as a betrayal rather than as a systemic vulnerability. This pattern repeats across time. The persistence of the cure is not about fasting or quackery alone. It is about the human desire for certainty in the face of suffering, and the social structures that reward those who supply it without accountability. Starvation Heights should not be remembered only as a place where people were starved. It should be remembered as a warning about what happens when care is privatized, belief is unchallenged, and vulnerability is treated as an opportunity rather than a responsibility. Chapter 19. The Ethics of Care When Certainty is Impossible. The most seductive thing Linda Hazzard offered was not fasting. It was certainty. Certainty can feel like care when you are frightened. It feels like someone taking the burden of doubt from your shoulders. It feels like a path through confusion. For many patients, especially those who had been dismissed or bounced between doctors without relief, certainty was the first form of kindness they had received in years. That is why Starvation Heights is not only a story about a cruel retreat. It is a story about what happens when people become so hungry for certainty that they accept suffering as proof. If we want to learn anything from this case, we have to stop treating certainty as inherently comforting. In care settings, certainty can be dangerous. It can override the patient's experience. It can silence questions. It can justify escalation. It can transform harm into something that looks like discipline. Ethical care begins with the acceptance that certainty is limited. In medicine, outcomes are not guaranteed. Bodies respond differently. Treatments carry risks. Honest practitioners acknowledge this. They do not offer absolute promises, and they do not turn uncertainty into a test of the patient's moral character. Hazzard's retreat did the opposite. It moralised uncertainty. If the patient suffered, it meant toxins were leaving. If the patient doubted, it meant resistance. If the patient declined, it meant the cure was working. If the patient died, it meant she was too damaged to be saved. This logic leaves no space for correction. A system that cannot be wrong cannot become safer. Ethical care requires not only compassion but accountability. Accountability is the willingness to be questioned and the willingness to change when evidence suggests harm. In a closed system, that willingness is rare because the system's survival depends on appearing right. Starvation Heights shows what happens when care becomes a performance rather than a relationship. A performance of care can look attentive, structured, even soothing. It can include routines, gentle voices, and declarations of concern. Yet it can be fundamentally coercive if the patient's autonomy is not protected. Autonomy is not simply the ability to choose a treatment. It is the ongoing ability to withdraw, to ask questions, to seek second opinions, and to refuse without punishment. This is where the language of choice becomes complicated. Patients at Starvation Heights may have chosen to arrive. Many did not retain meaningful choice once their bodies weakened and their world narrowed. They were fed a story that reframed danger as virtue and withdrawal as failure. Their distress was interpreted for them. Their fear became evidence against them. Their dependence was treated as proof of commitment. A patient cannot meaningfully choose when the conditions of choice have been eroded. The ethics of care therefore requires attention not only to what a patient consents to at the beginning, but to what conditions exist throughout the relationship. It requires recognition that consent can be compromised by hunger, isolation, dependence, and fear. In practical terms, ethical care requires safeguards. Access to outside contact. Clear pathways to exit. Independent oversight. Transparent documentation. Limits on financial entanglement. Protection against retaliation for questioning. These safeguards are not only institutional, they are moral. They express the belief that care should not demand surrender of self. Starvation Heights demanded surrender. It demanded that patients surrender appetite, surrender doubt, surrender outside voices, surrender financial control, surrender bodily signals. It required them to treat their own instincts as unreliable and Hazzard's interpretation as truth. That requirement is the opposite of ethical care, which should strengthen a patient's capacity to understand and advocate for themselves. One of the most uncomfortable aspects of Hazzard's story is that she could plausibly frame her demands as love. A disciplined regimen could be presented as responsible. Strict rules could be presented as protective. Isolation could be presented as restful. Obedience could be presented as commitment. This is why ethics cannot be measured only by intent. It must be measured by effect and by power. A practitioner can believe they are helping and still be doing harm. A practitioner can appear caring and still be coercive. The ethical question is not only what the practitioner feels, but what the practitioner controls and what the patient can refuse. In many care relationships, imbalance is unavoidable. Patients are vulnerable. Practitioners have knowledge, authority, and power. Ethical care is what limits that power. It is what keeps imbalance from becoming domination. Starvation Heights shows what happens when imbalance is allowed to expand unchecked. The case also reminds us that society plays a role in ethical failure. Patients did not arrive at Starvation Heights in a vacuum. They arrived because the broader culture made them vulnerable. When orthodox medicine dismissed their suffering, the retreat offered recognition. When social expectations demanded that people manage their health through willpower and discipline, fasting looked like virtue. When regulation was thin, a license looked like safety. Ethics is not only individual. It is structural. A society that leaves people desperate will produce markets for certainty. A society that confuses suffering with virtue will normalize harm. A society that treats care as private business will make oversight optional. To respond ethically, we must refuse the comfort of singular villains. Linda Hazzard mattered, but she was not the only factor. The retreat was possible because too many systems failed to protect the vulnerable and because too many cultural beliefs made coercion look like healing. If this sounds bleak, it contains its own form of hope. Because if the problem is structural, it is also changeable. Oversight can be strengthened. Consent can be rethought. Vulnerability can be treated as a public responsibility rather than a private weakness. Care can be structured so that people are less likely to be isolated, weakened, and controlled under the banner of wellness. Chapter 20: What Starvation Heights Demands of Memory. Starvation Heights endures not because it was shocking, but because it was plausible. That plausibility is the most difficult part of the story to sit with. It is easier to remember Linda Hazzard as an aberration, a dangerous woman, an extreme practitioner, a cautionary tale from a less regulated past. That version of the story offers distance and reassurance. It allows modern readers to believe that we would recognize the danger sooner, that our systems are stronger, that our choices are better informed. The historical record does not support that comfort. Starvation Heights was not hidden from the world. It operated openly. Patients arrived by choice. Locals noticed their condition. Authorities hesitated. The retreat continued because it fit within cultural expectations about discipline, health, and personal responsibility. It did not look like violence. It looked like care taken too far. This is why remembering the case responsibly requires restraint. Sensational retellings focus on the extremity of starvation and the strangeness of the cure. They invite horror and then release it. They do not require reflection. A structural account, by contrast, asks the reader to remain with discomfort, to consider how easily trust can be weaponized when suffering is widespread and oversight is weak. The lesson of Starvation Heights is not simply that people should be skeptical. It is that skepticism alone is not protection. Patients who arrived at the retreat were often intelligent, educated, and deliberate. They were not reckless. They were seeking relief after being failed repeatedly by systems that promised care but offered little understanding. In that context, certainty did not feel dangerous. It felt humane. This is the danger of certainty in care. When a practitioner offers absolute answers, the patient is relieved of doubt. But doubt is often what keeps a person safe. Doubt invites second opinions. Doubt preserves the right to leave. Doubt resists escalation. A system that treats doubt as pathology removes a critical safeguard. Starvation Heights punished doubt. It rewarded obedience. It reframed suffering as success. Those mechanisms are not relics. They continue to appear wherever care is privatized, unregulated, and framed as moral improvement. Remembering this case means remembering that harm does not always announce itself as cruelty. It can arrive as confidence. It can wear the language of healing. It can be delivered gently, patiently, and with conviction. The responsibility of history is not to reassure. It is to clarify. Clarification requires us to hold several truths at once. Linda Hazzard exercised private power that harmed and killed. She did so within a culture that rewarded her methods. Patients participated in her system without being responsible for its violence. Authorities intervened only when harm became undeniable. Punishment corrected a moment, but not a market. These truths are not comfortable, but they are instructive. Starvation Heights also demands that we reconsider how we talk about choice. Choice is meaningful only when alternatives are accessible and safe. A person choosing between chronic suffering and an extreme cure is not choosing freely. They are choosing under pressure. A society that celebrates choice while ignoring pressure abdicates responsibility. Ethical care requires more than consent forms and credentials. It requires vigilance against isolation, humility in the face of uncertainty, and structures that prioritize exit over endurance. It requires the recognition that authority must always be limited when it operates over vulnerable bodies. The retreat's greatest harm was not only starvation. It was the quiet transformation of care into control. That transformation is subtle. It does not depend on one ideology or one era. It depends on imbalance, too much authority on one side, too much need on the other. Whenever that imbalance is justified by certainty, harm becomes easier to excuse. This is why Starvation Heights belongs alongside estates, households, and institutions examined elsewhere in this body of work. The setting changes. The language changes. The mechanism remains recognizable. Private power thrives where trust is assumed and oversight is absent. Remembering Starvation Heights responsibly means resisting the urge to close the story neatly. It means refusing to turn it into entertainment or moral theater. It means keeping the focus on conditions rather than characters, on systems rather than spectacle. It also means acknowledging that the work of prevention is unfinished. The persistence of coercive care is not a failure of memory alone. It is a failure of structures to protect the vulnerable before harm becomes visible. History cannot fix that failure, but it can make it harder to ignore. If this book has an argument, it is a quiet one. That care without accountability is dangerous. That certainty without humility is corrosive. That trust without safeguards is a liability. Starvation Heights is not a warning from the past that we have outgrown. It is a mirror that reflects how easily harm can be sold as cure when desperation meets authority. What we do with that reflection remains an open question. Bibliography. This bibliography reflects the deliberately conservative approach taken throughout this manuscript. Preference has been given to contemporaneous reporting, court records where accessible, and later historical work that distinguishes clearly between documented fact and retrospective embellishment. Popular retellings have been consulted with caution and are not relied upon where they collapse speculation into certainty. Primary and near-contemporary sources. Hazzard, Linda Burfield. Fasting for the Cure of Disease. New York, 1908. Washington State vs. Linda Burfield Hazzard, Trial Records and Sentencing Summaries, 1911 to 1912. Contemporary newspaper coverage of Starvation Heights and the Williamson case, including regional Washington State papers and syndicated reports, 1908 to 1915. Death records and coroner reports relating to patients at Starvation Heights. Secondary historical sources. Historylink.org. Entries relating to Linda Burfield Hazzard, Starvation Heights, Olalla, and early 20th century alternative medicine in Washington State. Smithsonian Magazine. The Doctor Who Starved Her Patients to Death, and related historical features on Hazzard and early wellness culture. American Medical Reform and Sanitarium Histories addressing fasting, diet reform, and non-orthodox medical movements in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Legal Histories examining manslaughter, neglect, and medical malpractice prosecutions in early 20th century America. Women's history scholarship on female authority, caregiving, and credibility in medical and quasi-medical roles. Contextual and thematic works. Works on the history of alternative medicine and health reform movements in the United States. Scholarship on coercive control, dependency, and consent in institutional and semi-institutional care settings. Social histories of wellness culture, moral discipline, and bodily regulation. Studies of gendered credibility in courtrooms and medical authority.